Midway presents Arcade's Greatest Hits, the Atari Collection 1. Not only released for the Super Nintendo, but also for the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn game consoles. I'm only looking at the Super Nintendo version because that's all I got. Good enough of a reason, I suppose. So anyway, this cartridge comprises 6 classic Atari arcade games. Asteroids, Battlezone, Centipede, Super Breakout, and Tempest. Each offers a bunch of options such as difficulty select, lives count, and other tidbits. There's not much to the compilation besides the 6 games, so let's take a quick gander at each, shall we? Asteroids, the classic rock shooting game, manages to replicate the vector-based line graphics of the original arcade game quite well, I think. Control's rather good. You have access to all your usual abilities such as thrusters and hyperspeed. There's some noticeable slowdown during the later stages when the playfield is filled with stuff, but other than that, yeah, not too shabby actually. Very nice actually. Battlezone. Fairly familiar stuff. You control a tank from a first-person perspective and you blow up other tanks and stuff. Battlezone offers 2 control setups, arcade or native. The arcade setup, I assume, attempts to recreate the control setup of the original arcade game, but because I'm unfamiliar with the actual arcade machine, I found this control setup to be a bit too awkward, so I ended up using native controls, which are much more manageable for my meager hands. In any case, Battlezone plays fairly well, feels a bit slower than I'm used to, but it works well enough and the vector-based graphics look decent, so no real complaints. Centipede, the classic centipede killing arcade shooter. For the most part, this plays fairly well on the Super Nintendo, fast-paced. I find your shooter controls a bit too loosely, as it has a bit of a slippery feel to it. Presumably this was done to mimic the trackball controls of the arcade game, but it just feels a bit odd. I suppose it's too much to ask for Super Nintendo mouse support for somewhat better control, but whatever, it still plays good, nice and fast paced, no real complaints. Missile Command. Playing Missile Command with a digital D-pad to move the targeting cursor around felt clunky. I mean really clunky. I found myself not playing as well as I should have as a result. Another one of those trackball games where I wish there was SNES mouse support, but if you can manage with a D-pad, it's a solid conversion, no doubt about it. Super Breakout. Before there was Arkanoid, there was Breakout, and after Breakout, there was Super Breakout. You move a paddle with a D-pad, feels too jerky and somewhat hard to control, par for the course I suppose. I hate to beat that horse, but I really wish there was more mouse support here. Seriously, controlling a paddle with a mouse is practically a dream, not so with a D-pad. And finally we have Tempest, the classic tube shooter game that served as the precursor to that Atari Jaguar game that everybody likes to rave about but nobody's actually played. Because let's be honest, if they did, Atari would still be making video game consoles today. But they're not. Anyway, Tempest actually looks rather nice here. The bit where you're sliding down the tube is a bit too slow, but yeah, plays great with a D-pad, looks the part, sounds alright. Pretty good really. And that's the Atari Collection Volume 1. They never made a Volume 2 for the Super Nintendo. They did for the other 2 consoles, but again, visually speaking, they all look the part for the most part. The vector-based graphics are nicely rendered, the sprite-based stuff looks pretty good too, sound is almost on par with the arcade originals, as far as I know. That's about it really, nothing more to say in that regard. You got a bunch of customizable options per game. No real complaints really, well, aside from the lack of the SNES mouse support, which really would have made a couple of the games here control that much better, especially Super Breakout. For a Super Nintendo purchase, it's not a bad find for a couple bucks, and it's a rather solid compilation of classic Atari arcade games. Aside from some slowdown at certain points, they play fairly well, and you'll probably have a blast with these games if you enjoy old school early 80s arcade games. Not a bad set really. Of course there's better Atari compilations out there if you look hard enough, but this one's not too shabby either. Probably a hell of a lot cheaper too.